Hello to my friends, audience, and family. This is India Insight with Sunny Sharma. Today I'll be doing my part two discussion on the Great Migration, Harlem Renaissance and World War, 1915 to 1945, from plantation to ghetto. So I did a preview of the people involved in this section before. So go back if you need a reminder. Please go back to that intro to the last section, and you'll see those Black intellectuals and who they were. But I will go into depth of who many of these individuals are, starting with the beginning of my essay, starting now. So here we go. The African American communist organizer Angela Herndon, in her essay, You Cannot Kill the Working Class, also speaks to the drastic need for unity between blacks and whites. The author relates, after working on behalf of poor and unemployed blacks and whites in Atlanta, Georgia, Herndon was charged with insurrection in 1932. Correction, he's a man, not a woman. Sorry. Although he was found guilty in front of an all-white jury, the jurors recommended mercy. His case drew international attention after the court sentenced him to 18 to 20 years, and he consequently was released in 1936. When blacks and whites needed economic and food relief from the Great Depression, there was concerted efforts by the government to create animosity between the races. There were other black communist activists associated with Georgia, such as Hosea Hudson, born in rural Wilkes County, Georgia. After being fired from his job in 1932 for his communist affiliation, he began to work on the Works Progress Administration, WPA, served as vice president of the Birmingham and Jefferson County Locals of the Workers Alliance, was president of Steel Local 2815, and vice president of the Alabama Political Education Association. He not only worked underground as a communist in the 1950s and visited the Soviet Union in 1971. His involvement in the communist movement is also detailed in his book Black Worker in the Deep South and in Nell Irvin Painter's 1979 book The Narrative of Hosea Hudson. Another Southerner fighting for a united coalition among black people was the woman Mary McLeod Bethune, born to ex-slave parents in South Carolina. The authors describe her intense involvement in several organizations, including teaching as a young adult, founding the Daytona Normal and Industrial School in 1904, being elected to vice president of the National Urban League in 1920, being active for many years in the National Association of Colored Women, and being elected as president. However, what really brought her to national prominence was her position as director of the Negro Division of the National Youth Administration during the Great Depression. Furthermore, as the authors relate, in 1935 she was given the NAACP Spriggan Award, and in that same year was named president of the newly formed National Council of Negro Women. Bethune was an advisor to the U.S. delegation at the 1945 founding conference of the United Nations in San Francisco. Like the influential 19th century priest Alexander Crummell, Bethune speaks for the need for black fraternity at all costs, or to be relegated in the history books to obscurity as the law of life is the law of cooperation, and unless we learn thoroughly this fundamental tenet of social organization, I fear that the historian of the future, when he attempts to record the history of the black man in America, will write, a people possessed of tremendous possibilities, potentialities, and resources, mental and physical, but a people unable to capitalize on them because of their racial non-cohesiveness. Another prominent figure of Black employment who also completed advanced degrees at Union Theological Seminary and Columbia University was Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Raised in New York City, during the Great Depression in Harlem, he coined the phrase "Don't buy where you can't work" campaigns against white-owned businesses. The authors detail how he became an influential voice for civil rights. In 1937, Powell assumed his father's post as minister of Harlem's Abyssinian Baptist Church, and attracted a popular following within the black community through his flamboyant and confrontational rhetoric, in many ways similar to Marcus Garvey. While serving in Congress for a quarter of a century, he passed major educational and civil rights legislation. He created a 10-point platform for a job campaign where he demands such measures as providing greater employment opportunities for blacks to maintaining that the Harlem Job Committee will use any legal means possible to demand justice against employers who discriminate against blacks. There's also the overlooked demographic of Black women, who I mentioned very early on were very important to many social movements. Dr. Marable and Dr. Manning describe how throughout the Great Depression, African American women typically had to work full time and often faced discrimination, poor pay, and oppressive labor conditions. However, not just women were critical to organizing efforts such as expanding the Southern Tenant Farmers Union to a massive membership of 300,000 in the 1930s. There's also tremendous student involvement even before World War II. Student involvement through the Southern Negro Youth Conference in such places as Virginia, Tennessee, and Alabama not only sought to promote the economic status of African Americans, improve educational opportunities, and agitate on behalf of civil rights causes, their involvement also foreshadowed the critical role that young African Americans played in the modern civil rights movement later on. Asa Philip Randolph, born in Florida and educated in New York, was one of the premier civil rights activists. He started out as a radical labor activist, founding the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in 1925. Later on, became influential in trade union politics, in which he was a trailblazer in nonviolent direct action protest tactics. Was elected to the National Board of Directors of the NAACP, becoming its vice president in 1946, and was elected to the vice president of the AFL-CIO. He's most well known for his contribution to the March on Washington movement of 1941, where his main objection was against anti-Black discrimination in the defense industry. Through Randolph's advocacy and organizing, he managed to push President Franklin D. Roosevelt to establish the Fair Employment Practices Committee, and as a result, the march was called off. Randolph speaks to how intensely entangled racism is in the white establishment, as vested political interests and race prejudice are so deeply entrenched that to them, winning the war against Hitler is secondary to preventing Negroes from winning democracy for themselves. He was pointing out the fundamental hypocrisy that so many past Black luminaries fought for the struggle for Black liberation and the preservation for democracy at home, while being denied equality by those who fought outside of America to secure democracy abroad. Randolph also points out that democracy only works when it applies to everybody, shown through his declaration that a community is democratic only when the humblest and weakest person can enjoy the highest civil, economic, and social rights that the biggest and most powerful possess. This aspiration was not only advocated for by both Black and white proponents of liberty and justice in the past, but it also was a sentiment enshrined in the U.S. Constitution. The Harvard-trained lawyer and first African-American editor of the Harvard Law Review was Charles Hamilton Houston, born in Washington, D.C. While teaching at Harvard University, not only was one of his students Thurgood Marshall, a future Supreme Court justice, he also argued a number of cases before the Supreme Court. He is primarily credited with the establishing of many of the legal precedents that led up to the famous Brown v. Board of Education decision, which occurred 4 years after his death, while also being the principal architect of the legal campaign against Jim Crow. Another communist labor organizer during this period was Claudia Jones, who was born in Trinidad and moved to the Black Cultural Center of America, Harlem, in 1924. By 1940, she had risen to become the national chair of the Young Communist League, while also earning the admiration and respect of many groups for her activities concerning issues of civil rights, labor, and gender equality. In 1951, she was found guilty of violating the Smith Act, which made it illegal to advocate Marxism, and was expelled from the United States, eventually relocating to London. Jones' Black feminist thought influenced numerous prominent intellectuals such as Angela Davis. The essay in this anthology, An End to the Neglect of the Problems of the Negro Woman, presents an analysis of gender in the African American community from a Marxist perspective. In her section of this essay, Historical Aspects, she shares two important insights concerning Black women. And quote, and the fact that most of Negro people brought to these shores by the slave traders from West Africa, where the position of women based on active participation in property control was relatively higher in the family than that of European women. Jones also talks about how by taking on a range of responsibilities during the era of slavery and afterwards, Black women developed a variety of important and positive traits for survival, caregiving, and eventually advocacy, whereby necessarily playing an important role in the economic and social life of her people, the Negro woman became schooled in self-reliance and courageous and selfless action. In this section of the essay, Key Issues of Struggle, she recognizes that only by acknowledging the place of Black women in the overall women's rights movement can the movement ever fathom being successful and comprehensive enough to warrant liberation of all people. For the progressive women's movement, the Negro woman who combines in her status the worker, the Negro, and the woman, in her status the worker, the Negro, and the woman is the vital link to this heightened political consciousness. Paul Robeson, born in Princeton, New Jersey, was a tremendously important figure, not just the Black liberation struggle, but also giving voice to the importance of solidarity against corruption, whether it is seen through fascism or capitalism. Starting out as an All-American football player and valedictorian from Rutgers University, later Robson earned a law degree from Columbia Law School, became most notably a famous actor, began involvement in civil rights, scholarship, and even writing. He was truly a world citizen. During the Great Depression in America, he was probably the most popular and influential Black public figure. The author describes how, in London, he worked on behalf of labor, African liberation, and other issues. He traveled to Spain during its civil war to express solidarity with the Republican forces combating fascism. However, due to his affinity for socialism, he was targeted by the United States government, which resulted in many of his performances being canceled, the seizing of his passport, and the loss of potential profits. In a long legal battle, he eventually got his passport back and left the country. Today, a new generation of activists and young people who've worked to keep his enduring legacy alive despite a concerted effort to damage his life. In his writing, The Negro Artist Looks Ahead, Robson argues we can only achieve a world where the dignity of all people is recognized if we understand the power of the people, the masses, and Black unity. Lastly, we'll be looking at Thurgood Marshall. The Howard Law School trained lawyer who also studied at Lincoln University was born in Maryland. Thurgood Marshall was perhaps one of the most important legal minds in American history. Dr. Marable and Dr. Manning describe his achievements, whereby starting in 1938 at the age of 30, he joined the staff of the NAACP, where he helped the organization establish its legal fund and education fund. Legal Defense and Education Fund. He's most notably known for his serving as counsel in front of the Supreme Court on the famous Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas case, which made discrimination in education unconstitutional. The foundation of this decision was established under the 14th Amendment, which declared in relation to this case that segregation deprived children of equal protection under the Constitution, primarily the 14th Amendment. This overturned the previous precedent of separate but equal established in the Plessy v. Ferguson case of 1896. Later, Marshall served as a federal judge, became Solicitor General of the U.S., and became the first African American to be appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1967. Dr. Marable and Dr. Manning eloquently describe his impact as, for more than 2 decades, Marshall represented the voice of civil rights and social justice on the High Court, which today have become increasingly conservative due to judicial appointments under President Nixon and Reagan. In his essay, Segregation and Desegregation, Marshall relates the history of the early abolitionists from 1820 to 1865 and the fundamental moral foundation behind the idea of equal protection before it became legislated as an amendment in 1868. They sought to constitutionalize this moral argument or ideal. Slavery, with its theories of racial discrimination, racial inferiority, and racial marginalization, was inherently repugnant to the American creed and Christian ethic. Slavery would not have been defeated if it was not for the abolitionist movement, a movement which sought to underscore fundamentally a higher morality behind legislative provisions and principles, supported by leaders such as Frederick Douglass, President Abraham Lincoln, Thurgood Marshall, and others. Now to conclude my analysis of this section. The period from plantation to ghetto, the Great Migration, Harlem Renaissance, and World War in 1915 and 1954, despite being an only 40-year period, was a period of immense transformation and shift in consciousness of the Black community. Although slavery was illegal constitutionally, local governments and institutions found ways to bar African Americans from the same opportunities whites had, as evidenced by the rise of Jim Crow in the South. Even in the North, where many Blacks migrated to during the Great Migration, many Blacks were banned from certain jobs and denied entry into certain workers' unions. This led to a push for Blacks to form their own unions or convince whites to organize into newfound labor organizations with them. With the Russian Revolution, many Blacks felt Marxist theories could lead to the development of coalitions with other groups and the realization of world-changing revolutions that would bring equal opportunity to all groups, including white and Black women. For the Blacks that didn't view World War I and II as mere imperialist exploitation, nor the Great Migration as merely a change in place from south to north, there's hope that they could take advantage of these groundbreaking trends. Ultimately, even though this turned out to be false reality, as America was still very unequal, these massive shifts and events did contribute to the bursting of creativity that was the Harlem Renaissance. Giants like Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, Zora Neale Hurston, and others redefined Black influence on wider American culture while also redefining the so-called New Negro, one who is entitled to the rights, privileges, and respects of an American society that still was fundamentally unequal. To men like W.E.B. Du Bois, the Harlem Renaissance was the fulfillment of his declaration that African Americans, like the other European civilizations, would produce something of value to civilization. The value which African Americans were producing was like the Romance cultures, arts and literature, but in some sense went beyond it in terms of music, such as blues and eventually jazz, coined by such figures as Langston Hughes. Intellectually speaking, the rise of Thurgood Marshall to the position of Justice of the Supreme Court spoke to not just how far African Americans have come, but also spoke to the legacy of Black activism, the translation of higher moral principles into judicial legislation, and the recognition of this higher truth. Throughout American history, Black leaders were the moral and social conscience of American society. Now, this conscience could contribute to the wider American project in the legal landscape through the proliferation of constitutional morality. However, with so much progress followed by a whole new generation of political activism accompanied by the civil rights movement, there would be tremendous pushback back both legally and economically. For decades, the Supreme Court and corporations would expand just as they did. For decades, the Supreme Court and lower judicial courts would be packed by more conservative ideologues. Especially today, and corporations would expand just as they did in the late 19th century and early 20th century. In the next section, we shall overcome the Second Reconstruction, 1954 to 1975. The New Left movement would bring to the forefront a variety of marginalized groups and new coalitions, but would ultimately see a resurgence of Black nationalism. Not only a paradigm shift that would take place under new leaders, but also collectively among the populace, disillusioned by a system's brutality that never really went away. However, new coalitions would be led by a revolutionary new tactic and leader, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who would advocate active nonviolent civil disobedience, which through satyagraha and agape love would lead to newfound legislative achievements in the mid-1960s. These achievements, though groundbreaking, were still part of a large pluralism of movements, including cultural nationalism, revolutionary Black nationalism, and Black power, as reflected through such leaders as Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael, who would replace the equally revolutionary young leader John Lewis as the head of as SNCC in 1966. Furthermore, these approaches would not just shift the consciousness of many Blacks, they would leave an enduring legacy that only grew as time went on, that almost equaled the aspirations for the beloved community that sought the realization of Christian love. During this later period of 1954 to 1975, characterized by the New Left movement, although many leaders disagreed, the reality is that many of these leaders drew closer to each other the older they got, whereby they nearly all demanded an end to imperialistic war, and an elimination of economic exploitation, an acknowledgement of human rights on the international stage, and the formation of a coalition between the African diaspora and the global South. Today, we not only see rampant inequality, but also an immense divide in power between developed and developing nations. The moral authority of some of the leaders of the New Left movement in 1954 to 1975 would engender some of the clearest rousing, radical, and philosophical indictments in American history of the political establishment and war finance nexus that have contributed to a world where the rich and powerful continue to benefit from the labor of the poor. If you enjoyed this video podcast, please like, follow, share, and subscribe for future episodes. My podcast is called India Insight with Sunny Sharma, and my YouTube channel is Sunny Sharma at India Inside Movement. These 6 episodes are in honor of Black History Month in February. They're more than 6 episodes because some of these parts are broken up into 2 parts. In the description below are the titles for the upcoming new episodes based off of the 5 sections reflecting the 5 periods of American history since 1768 up till 2008 with the seminal election of Barack Obama to the presidency. These sections are based off the book Let Nobody Turn Us Around, an African American anthology. So my next podcast will also be broken up into 2 parts. It will be released. The first part will be released on February 24th. On We Shall Overcome the Second Reconstruction, 1954 to 1975, and the second part will be released on February 25th. I'll be concluding with my last part on February 28th, as well as part 2 of that podcast on March 1st. So now just to preview the next podcast, the Brown v. Board of Education case was a very important case. And also, this launched the beginning of this period we shall overcome, which began with the leadership of Martin Luther King, seen through the Montgomery bus boycott, which was led by such women as Rosa Parks and Joanna Gibson Robinson. Rosa Parks is seen as the mother of the civil rights movement. And in 1955 and 1956, Martin Luther King was made the de facto leader of the civil rights movement. in Alabama. There is also many important figures such as Roy Wilkins, who was the executive director of the NAACP for several years. SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, founded by Dr. King in 1957. The Student and Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, under the leadership of Ella Baker and John Lewis, emerged in 1960. There also was the importance of freedom songs such as "We Shall Overcome" and ain't gonna let nobody turn me around," which inspired not only the title of this anthology, but was critical to expressing solidarity and faith in the movement. Um, as we will go over this now, I'll only glance through this in the next podcast, so I won't waste too much of your time. Ella Baker was a tremendous human rights advocate who, even though she worked behind the scenes, was tremendously important to the civil rights movement. And following her and even though Ella Baker thought there should not be messiah leaders, she was very much in support of Dr. King, who became the leader of the civil rights movement, the political and moral leader of the Black freedom movement of this era. And John Lewis, who was one of the youngest leaders of this movement, became tremendously important. He was deeply embedded in this movement and very much was a representation of what this movement was about. He was involved in the sit-ins, the bus boycotts, and the marches. He was one of several people, well, a handful of people who's involved in all of these movements. As you see here, he's receiving the Medal of Freedom from Barack Obama for his contribution, not just to civil rights, but also as a political leader in Georgia. We also W.E.B.D. Du Bois is a very pivotal figure who I point out in many of these podcasts because he lived a very long life, and he was perhaps one of the most important Black intellectuals of the period from Reconstruction all the way up to the passing of the important civil rights legislation. And he, in many ways, is credited with the passing of this legislation. He was a blacklisted socialist. Many of his ideas were blacklisted near the end of his life, but his ideas were very important. Fannie Lou Hamer, who grew up in rural poverty, was an impeccable civil rights organizer who, at the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, gave a rousing indictment of the oppression of Blacks in America. So that's part one of the discussion. Part two of the discussion begins with Malcolm X, who spoke against capitalist exploitation, political opportunism, and the need for grassroots activism from the ground up to create the conditions for Black development. There also was Stokely Carmichael, who was one of the main proponents of Black Power and was a Pan-Africanist activist. And Bayard Rustin, who a movie was made about him last year. He was one of the most important civil rights strategists, along with James Lawson. He was also a critic of the Black nationalist movement. There's an interview between him and Malcolm X where he criticizes the Black nationalist movement as distracting from the achievements of civil rights. Whether that is wrongly or rightly, it depends upon who you ask. There's also Floyd McKissick, who was a lawyer in 1966 who superseded James Farmer as the leader of the Congress of Racial Equality. In the Black Panther Party, in this picture, there's a picture of Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton, who are the founders of the Black Panther Party for self-defense. In the future podcast, part two, it will be part two of "We Shall Overcome." It will be discussed further. There is the head of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party, Fred Hampton, who was critical of capitalism and a big proponent of Marxist theory and of the Black Revolutionary movement. There's also Angela Davis, another proponent of Marxist theory and feminist and intellectual feminism, who inspired in many ways Dr. Michelle Alexander, who wrote the book The New Jim Crow, which was critical of the mass incarceration system in the modern era that has grown since the 1970s and 1980s to really immense and drastic, very bad level. There's some movements that were very important. The League of Revolutionary Black Workers, which was a movement guided by Black liberation and Marxist thought to unite auto workers and other industrial sectors. It was a movement of a variety of occupational organizations for better rights. There was the Attica Prisoner Revolt. It was a demand to improve prison conditions when prisoners took over jail, and it took on national appeal and is even many of their points of their program are pivotal to prison development today. And we need those points to reform the prison system even today. There was the National Black Political Convention in 1972, a gathering of thousands of Black civil rights leaders, politicians, and cultural icons that resulted in the Glary Declaration that stated Americans' political system was failing Blacks, and to remedy this, there must be a transition to independent Black politics. One of the figures, Amiri Baraka, was very prominent to the Gary Convention. He was a prominent cultural icon, poet, and a teacher at several universities, and a music critic. He was a cultural giant who was very important to this movement. And lastly, we'll be looking at Henry Winston, who was a civil rights proponent of racial equality, well before it was a mainstream idea, while also advocating a Marxist interpretation of race in America. So as you see here, there are many important figures in the struggle for Black liberation. There's still a strain of Marxist thought carried on by many of these individuals, but as you'll see later, Black nationalism and Black power was not able to produce a cohesive and comprehensive system when compared to the aspirations of the beloved community touted by the civil rights leader, and this would have consequences for how we view cultural nationalism in the future, how people culturally express themselves, because even though Black nationalism and Black power may have not been a comprehensive system, it was still influential in shaping Black culture in the future. Just as the nonviolent movement, supported by Martin Luther King, was also very influential in influencing future non-civil disobedience movements around the world. As Martin Luther King was inspired by numerous theologians, which I'll talk about in the next podcast. So yeah, that's the end of it, and I thank you for listening, and I hope you will join me for my next podcast on "We Shall Overcome: The Second Reconstruction from 1954 to 1975," which will be divided into two parts. Okay, thank you.